Under the pale glow of the moon, I saw it emerge from the shadows, its skin stretched thin like glass, every bone glinting faintly in the silver light. It moved slowly, unnaturally, as if the weight of its existence was too much to bear, and then it turned its hollow gaze toward me. It was the kind of night where the world felt alive under the moonlight. The forest behind my house was bathed in a silver glow, every leaf shimmering with dew. I had taken up the habit of late night walks to clear my mind, to escape the drudgery of daily life. The path was familiar, one I had tread 100 times. But that night I noticed something different. At first I thought it was the play of shadows, a faint shimmer just beyond the line of trees. My footsteps slowed as I peered into the woods, my heart thrumming with unease. The shimmer moved, gliding between the trees like a ghost. My breath hitched when I saw it step into the moonlight. It was humanoid but impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and bent at unnatural angles. Its skin, or what passed for it, was transparent, stretched taut over its glowing skeleton. Every bone was visible, gleaming faintly like polished ivory. It moved slowly, its head tilting as if it was listening. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The creature turned toward me. Its face, or lack of one, was what sent the first wave of terror through me. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, translucent surface. But I knew it saw me. I could feel its attention, like a weight pressing down on my chest. And then it moved, stepping closer with an unsettling grace. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The creature stopped, tilting its head again. Then it turned and vanished into the trees, leaving me standing alone in the cold night air. I didn't sleep that night. My mind replayed the encounter over and over, dissecting every detail. By morning, I had convinced myself it was a hallucination, a trick of the light, or my imagination running wild. But the next night, it returned. This time, it stood at the edge of the forest, unmoving, watching. It didn't step closer, but its presence was suffocating. I locked my doors and windows, retreating to my bedroom. But even behind the safety of walls, I felt its gaze. Over the following weeks, the creature became a fixture of my nights. It appeared under the moonlight, always watching, always waiting. I began researching, desperate for answers. I found old stories, myths about creatures that lived between worlds, drawn to those who noticed them. The stories all ended the same way: the person vanished, leaving behind only a faint shimmer in the air. One night I made the mistake of following it. My curiosity overpowered my fear as I stepped into the forest, the creature gliding ahead like a wraith. The further I went, the more the world around me changed. The air grew colder, the trees taller, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. The moonlight seemed to dim, and the creature stopped in a clearing. It turned to face me, its glowing bones radiating an unnatural light. For the first time, it raised a hand, pointing to the ground. I looked down and froze. There, etched into the dirt, was my name. It started with a sound, a faint tapping at my window, like branches scraping against the glass. I live on the second floor, so I ignored it at first. But when the tapping grew more insistent, I couldn't help but look. At first, I saw nothing but the dark expanse of my backyard. Then, in the faint glow of the moonlight, I saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, pacing slowly under the trees. Its movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, its skeletal frame illuminated through translucent skin. The moonlight reflected off its bones, casting eerie shadows on the ground. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it. It didn't seem to notice me, or maybe it didn't care. Just kept walking, its head turning slightly as if searching for something. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. I told myself it was a trick of the light, but deep down I knew better. The figure returned the next night, and the night after that, always at the same time, always pacing. The same path. I began to notice patterns. It never crossed into the light of the house, staying just beyond the reach of the porch lamp. It didn't look up, but its presence felt intentional, like it knew I was watching. I started asking neighbors if they'd seen anything strange, but their answers only deepened my unease. "We don't look outside after dark," one of them said, their voice trembling. Another whispered, "You shouldn't either." The figure's behavior grew more unsettling. It began stopping directly below my window, its head tilting upward. Though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze piercing through the glass. It started scratching patterns into the dirt, shapes that looked like runes or symbols. One night I saw it carving something else, my name. Shone. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront it, armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat. When I stepped outside, the air felt heavy, suffused with an unnatural chill. The figure stood still, its bones glowing faintly in the darkness. I shone the flashlight on it, and for the first time it moved toward me. Its gait was slow but deliberate, and I stumbled back, the bat slipping from my hands. As it approached, I saw its bones weren't just glowing, they were etched with tiny symbols, patterns that seemed to shift and writhe. The figure stopped inches away, its head tilting as if studying me. Then it spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural whisper that echoed in my mind. "Your time is near," it said. Before I could respond, it turned and disappeared into the shadows. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside my window. They weren't human. I found the first pile of bones while hiking. They were arranged in a perfect circle, each one polished and gleaming in the sunlight. At the center of the circle was a skull, its empty socket staring upward. I should have turned back then, but curiosity got the better of me. As I explored deeper into the woods, I found more bone circles. Each one was larger than the last, the arrangements more intricate. It was as if someone or something was creating them with deliberate care. The air grew colder the further I went, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I heard it before I saw it. A faint rustling, followed by the sound of bones clicking together. Then it stepped into view, a towering figure made entirely of bones, its translucent skin stretched tightly over its skeletal frame. Its head turned slowly toward me, and though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze boring into me. The creature didn't move at first, but as I backed away, it followed. Its movements were jerky, as if it hadn't fully learned how to use its limbs. I ran, the sound of clicking bones echoing behind me. That night, I dreamt of the creature. In the dream, it stood over me, its bony hand outstretched. When I woke, I found a single bone on my pillow, a finger bone, etched with tiny symbols. The creature began appearing outside my home, standing motionless in the shadows. Its bones seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, and each time it came, it was larger, as if it had collected more pieces of itself. I realized with growing horror that it wasn't complete, and I was its final piece. The stories had been passed down for generations, whispered around campfires and exchanged in hushed tones at the local tavern. They all revolved around one thing: the curse. No one knew its origins for sure, but everyone in the town seemed to agree on 2 points. First, it always started with the full moon. Second, once the curse marked you, there was no escape. I never believed the tales. To me, they were nothing more than superstitions designed to scare children. But that changed the night I saw it for myself. It began innocuously enough. I was walking home from a friend's house, the streets empty and bathed in the silver glow of the full moon. The air was cool, the kind that made your skin prickle. I heard the sound first, a low, mournful wail that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. Stopped, straining to locate its source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the street, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and impossibly thin, its body outlined by the moonlight. Its skin was nearly transparent, stretched taut over its glowing bones. Every movement it made was deliberate, almost mechanical, as if it wasn't entirely sure how to use its limbs. It tilted its head in my direction, and though it had no eyes, I knew it was looking at me. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The stories came flooding back about how the creature only appeared during the full moon, about how it marked its victims before dragging them into the darkness. The creature took a slow, deliberate step toward me, its glowing bones casting eerie shadows on the ground. I ran. The street seemed endless as I sprinted toward my house, the sound of my own ragged breaths, drowning out the wail that now seemed to follow me. When I finally slammed my front door shut, I collapsed against it, my body trembling. For a moment, there was silence. Then, faintly, I heard it. Again, the wail, closer this time. I peeked through the curtains, and my stomach churned. The creature stood at the edge of my yard, unmoving, its skeletal hand raised as if beckoning me. I didn't sleep that night. The creature stayed there until dawn, disappearing with the first rays of sunlight. But I knew it wasn't gone. It was waiting. Over the next few days, I began to notice changes. Shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching unnaturally across the walls. My reflection in the mirror lingered a beat too long, its eyes hollow and lifeless. The wail returned each night, growing louder, closer. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was everywhere, watching, waiting for the next full moon. Desperate for answers, I turned to the town's oldest resident, an elderly woman named Martha. She listened intently as I described the creature, her face pale and grim. "It's the curse," she said finally. "You've been marked." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. She hesitated before answering. "The creature is tied to the sins of the past. It comes for those whose families are connected to the curse. It won't stop until it claims you." I felt a chill run down my spine. My family had lived in this town for generations, but I knew nothing of their history. Martha told me about an old journal that might hold answers. It was buried in the town archives, a relic of a time long forgotten. The journal revealed the truth. Centuries ago, my ancestors had made a pact with something they didn't understand. They had sacrificed lives for prosperity, binding the town to an ancient force that demanded payment every full moon. And now, the debt had fallen to me. The night of the next full moon, the wail returned, louder and more haunting than ever. The creature appeared in my yard, its glowing bones brighter than before. But this time it didn't stop at the edge. It moved closer, its skeletal frame rattling with each step. I tried to run, but the air grew heavy, pinning me in place. The creature reached out, its hand brushing my chest. The touch was cold, piercing, as if it was pulling something from me. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw was its glowing form, leaning closer, its hollow face inches from mine. The door wasn't there yesterday. That was my first thought as I stood in the hallway of my apartment, staring at the wooden door that had appeared overnight. It was plain, unremarkable, except for the fact that it was impossible. I'd walked through this hallway hundreds of times, and there had never been a door there. I reached out tentatively, running my fingers over the smooth surface. It felt solid, real. I tried the handle, but it didn't budge. For a moment, I thought about calling my landlord, but something about the door made me hesitate. It wasn't just its sudden appearance, it was the way the air around it felt. Heavier, colder. That night, I dreamed of the door. In the dream, it stood ajar, a faint light spilling out from within. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, and peered inside. The room beyond was empty, except for a single chair in the center. As I approached, the chair began to move, rocking back and forth as if someone had just stood up. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The door became an obsession. I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop dreaming about it. Each night, the dreams grew more vivid. The room beyond the door filled with strange objects, old photographs, broken clocks, and mirrors that reflected things that weren't there. The whispers began soon after. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder with each passing night, calling my name. One morning, I found a key on the floor in front of the door. My stomach churned as I picked it up, the metal cold against my skin. My hands trembled as I slid the key into the lock. The door creaked, open, revealing the room from my dreams. The air was cold, and the faint smell of decay filled my nostrils. The objects from my dreams were scattered across the room, each one more unsettling than the last. A photograph of me as a child, though I had no memory of it being taken. A clock ticking backward, its hands spinning faster with each second. And then I saw the chair, rocking gently in the center of the room. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The whispers turned into screams, overlapping voices that echoed in my head. The walls seemed to close in, the objects shifting and distorting as the room darkened. I turned back to the door, but it was gone, replaced by a blank wall. I was trapped. I found the photograph while cleaning out my attic. It was tucked inside an old box of family mementos, a black and white snapshot of a group of people at a picnic. I recognized my grandparents, my parents, and even myself as a child sitting cross-legged on a blanket. But in the background, barely visible under the shade of a tree, stood a stranger. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by shadows. At first I thought nothing of it, just a passerby, caught in the frame. But something about him unsettled me. His stance was too deliberate, his gaze too focused. It felt as though he was staring directly at me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I began searching through more family photos. To my horror, the stranger appeared again and again, always in the background, always watching. Sometimes he was closer, his face still hidden but his presence undeniable. The more I searched, the more I realized he had been there my entire life. I first noticed it on a night when the moon hung low and full, bathing everything in an otherworldly silver light. I was brushing my teeth, staring into the bathroom mirror, when I caught at my shadow, lagged behind me. I raised my hand, but the shadow moved a second too late, its outline jittery, almost unstable. I froze, staring at it, convinced I was just overtired. It was just my imagination, I told myself, turning off the light and heading to bed. The next day, it happened again. I waved goodbye to a friend at the door, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw my shadow linger. It wasn't just slow this time, it moved differently, almost deliberately, as though it were testing its boundaries. I shook off the unease, attributing it to stress or bad lighting, but the discomfort lingered. Over the next few nights, the discrepancies became impossible to ignore. My shadow would twist, unnaturally, stretching across the wall in ways that defied logic. At first, it was subtle, a hand slightly out of place, a leg bending at an impossible angle. But soon, it began moving independently, shifting. When I was perfectly still, it would watch me, its head tilted unnaturally, mimicking a posture I hadn't made. One night, as I lay in bed, I woke to the sensation of being watched. I turned toward the window, expecting to see a figure outside. Instead, I saw my shadow standing against the far wall, darker and more defined than it should have been. Its form shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and for the first time I saw the faint outline of its skeleton beneath the shadowy surface. I bolted upright, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadow didn't move, didn't waver. It just stood there, its bony frame illuminated faintly, a grotesque reflection of my own. I closed my eyes, willing it to be a dream, and when I opened them, it was gone. But the next day, my unease turned to terror when my best friend called me in confusion. "Why didn't you stop to say hi yesterday?" she asked. "I saw you in town, but when I waved, you just walked away." "I wasn't in town yesterday," I replied, my voice trembling. Over the following days, similar calls came in from friends and colleagues. They had seen me at the park, on the street, even outside their windows late at night. But I hadn't left my house. The shadow was no longer content to linger. It was living my life. I tried everything to sever its connection to me. I avoided the moonlight, locked myself in dark rooms, even covered every mirror in my house. But the shadow followed me, becoming bolder with each passing day. I began waking to find skeletal footprints leading from my bed to the door, their faint glow lingering on the floorboards. Then, one night, it spoke. Its voice was a distorted echo of my own, resonating deep within my mind. "You don't deserve this. Life," it said. "It's my turn now." The shadow began to solidify, its skeleton taking shape, its movements eerily human. I knew it was only a matter of time before it replaced me entirely. The story ends with me trapped in darkness, watching helplessly as my shadow steps into the light, taking my place in the world. It started with a fleeting glimpse, a flash of something unfamiliar in the bathroom mirror as I washed my face. It was gone so quickly that I almost dismissed it, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light. But the feeling of being watched lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The next night I saw it again. This time it was clearer. A face just behind mine, hovering in the fog reflection. It wasn't my face. It was a woman's, her features gaunt, her eyes hollow. She stared at me, with an expression of pure anguish before vanishing into the shadows. I covered the mirror with a towel, hoping that would solve the problem. But the faces didn't stop. They appeared in every reflective surface, the windows, the glossy screen of my phone, even the faint sheen of a puddle on the sidewalk. Each time they seemed closer, their expressions more desperate, as though they were trying to tell me something. One night, I made the mistake of speaking to one. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling as I stared at the mirror. The woman's lips moved, but no sound came. Then slowly, her hand pressed against the glass, her skeletal fingers visible beneath her translucent skin. She mouthed one word: "Help." I stepped back, the air around me growing cold. The mirror began to ripple, the surface distorting like water. More faces appeared, their mouths open in silent screams, their hands clawing at the glass. I ran from the room, slamming the door behind me, but the images were burned into my mind. Over the next few days, the faces grew more aggressive. They didn't just appear, they followed me. Shadows formed in my peripheral vision, and faint whispers echoed in the corners of my home. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as though the faces were pressing against me from the other side. I tried to destroy the mirrors, smashing them with whatever I could find, but the faces didn't stop. They appeared in new places, in reflections that shouldn't have existed. And then, one night I woke to find every mirror in my house uncovered, the faces staring at me in unison. They spoke in a single, deafening voice: "Join us." The glass shattered, and everything went dark. When I woke, I was no longer in my house. I was standing in a world of endless reflections, surrounded by the faces I had seen. I realized with horror that I was now one of them, trapped in the mirror, watching helplessly as someone else moved into my life. It began with a single photograph discovered while I was cleaning out my grandparents' attic. It was an old black and white snapshot of a family picnic. I recognized my parents and grandparents, immediately sitting on a blanket, laughing. But there was someone else in the photo, a tall, thin man standing in the background, his face partially obscured by shadows. I assumed he was just a passerby, caught in the frame by accident. But something about his posture, the way he seemed to be staring at the family, sent a chill down my spine. I found more photos as I sorted through the attic. In each one, the man was there, always in the fear background, always watching. Sometimes he was closer, his features still obscured, but his presence undeniable. By the time I found the fifth photo, my hands were trembling. The man hadn't aged a day. I asked my parents about the photos, but they seemed confused. "What man?" my mother asked, her eyes scanning the image. She didn't see him. No one did. But I knew he was there. The sightings didn't stop with the photographs. I began seeing him in my daily life, a fleeting figure. In the crowd, a shadow standing beneath a street lamp. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then The notes started appearing. Scraps of paper with my name written on them, left in places only I could find. One night I woke to the sound of footsteps in my house. My heart raced as I crept toward the noise, clutching a flashlight. In the living room, I found a single photograph on the coffee table. It was a picture of me, taken as I slept, with the man standing at the foot of my bed. The story ends with the man stepping out of the shadows, his face finally revealed a distorted, skeletal version of my own. He smiles, and I realize too late that he isn't just a stranger. He's me, from a life I was never meant to remember. The hiking trail was my sanctuary. I'd spent countless afternoons walking its winding paths, finding solace in the towering trees and the gentle hum of nature. But that night, the trail felt different. Full moon hung low in the sky, its light bathing the forest in an eerie glow. The familiar sight seemed distorted, the shadows longer, deeper, almost alive. I wasn't alone. It began with a sound of faint rustling in the bushes, too deliberate to be the wind. My footsteps faltered, and I turned toward the noise, squinting into the darkness. That's when I saw a figure, standing just off the trail, its translucent form shimmering faintly in the moonlight. Its bones glowed beneath its skin, casting an unearthly light that sent a chill down my spine. The figure didn't move, but its head tilted slightly, as though it were observing me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, my breath caught in my throat. The creature's skeletal form seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the forest, as if it were part of the woods themselves. Finally, it stepped closer. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and utterly unnatural. The faint glow of its bones illuminated the ground around it, revealing twisted roots and gnarled branches that seemed to writhe in the moonlight. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and the creature paused, tilting its head once more. Then, without warning, it turned and glided deeper into the woods. Against all reason, I followed. The trail began to change. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The air grew colder, and the once familiar path twisted into a labyrinth of roots and shadows. I tried to turn back, but every step seemed to take me further into the woods. The creature remained just ahead, always out of reach but never disappearing entirely. My flashlight flickered, its beam cutting through the darkness in uneven bursts. That's when I saw them other figures. Like the first, their glowing skeletons scattered throughout the forest. Some stood motionless, their empty eye sockets fixed on me. Others moved slowly, their translucent forms blending into the shadows. Panic set in, as I realized the forest wasn't just alive, it was watching me. I stumbled into a clearing, the moonlight filtering through the branches above. At the center stood a massive tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted, its roots sprawling like veins. The figures surrounded it, their skeletal frames swaying as if caught in a silent ritual. And then I saw my name, carved into the bark, glowing faintly like the bones of the creatures. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. This wasn't just a forest. It was a trap, a place where the moonlight revealed the forgotten, the lost. The creatures weren't just watching, they were waiting. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the tree's roots moving, twisting toward me, pulling me into the earth. It started with the sound of footsteps. Late at night, when the world was quiet, I'd hear them outside my window. Slow, deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. At first, I thought it was just a stray animal or a passing stranger. But as the nights went on, the footsteps grew louder, heavier, almost skeletal. One night, I mustered the courage to look. Peering through the curtains, I froze. A figure stood in them. Moonlit yard, its form impossibly thin, its bones glowing faintly through translucent skin. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, featureless surface that seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. It was pacing, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it were testing its own limbs. I stayed awake until dawn, watching as the figure disappeared with the first rays of sunlight. I convinced myself it was a hallucination, a trick of the light, or a figment of my imagination. But the next night, it returned. The pacing continued, and then it escalated. I began to find scratches on the ground outside my window, symbols I didn't recognize, etched deep into the dirt. The figure grew bolder, venturing closer to the house. One night, I woke to find skeletal handprints on the glass, their faint glow lingering like an after-image. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront the figure, armed with a flashlight and a shaky resolve. I stepped outside. The air was cold, thick with an unnatural stillness. The figure stood at the edge of the yard, motionless, as if waiting for me. I shone the flashlight on it, and for the first time it turned toward me. Its glowing bones seemed to pulse, and its featureless face tilted as if studying me. Then it raised a hand and pointed to the ground. I followed its gesture and saw a pile of bones at its feet. At first they seemed random, just a collection of ribs, femurs, and a cracked skull. But as I looked closer, I noticed something chilling. The skull was human, and it was etched with symbols that matched the scratches on the ground. The figure took a step forward, and I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hands. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. It didn't answer. Instead, it knelt by the pile of bones and began rearranging them, its movements precise and deliberate. As it worked, the air grew colder, and the symbols etched into the ground began to glow. I realized with growing horror that it wasn't just collecting bones, it was building something. The story ends with the figure finishing its work and turning toward me, its skeletal creation rising. Behind it, glowing faintly in the moonlight, I was the next piece. The woods had always been a place of mystery. Growing up, I'd heard stories about people who ventured too deep and never returned. My friends and I used to dare each other to explore the trails, but we never went far. There was something about the silence of the forest, the way the trees seemed to press in around you, that kept us close to the edge. It wasn't until years later, as an adult, that I decided to go back. I told myself it was nostalgia, a way to reconnect with my childhood. But as I stepped onto the trail, I felt that same unease creeping over me. The air was heavy, the shadows deeper than I remembered. Still, I pressed on, determined to conquer my lingering fear. The first sign that something was wrong came about an hour into the hike. The path, which had always been well-worn and easy to follow, seemed to shift beneath my feet. I turned a corner and found myself standing in a clearing I didn't recognize. At its center was a pile of bones, arranged in a perfect circle. DSA. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The bones gleamed faintly in the sunlight, and though I couldn't identify them, I knew they didn't belong to any animal I'd ever seen. As I stepped closer, the air grew colder, and I noticed something else, symbols carved into the surrounding trees, there, shapes jagged and unnatural. I should have turned back then, but something compelled me to stay. As I studied the bones, a sound broke the silence, of faint, almost imperceptible clicking, like stones tapping together. I turned, and my heart nearly stopped. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing. It was impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its skin was translucent, stretched tight over glowing bones that seemed to radiate their own light. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. I took a step back, and it tilted its head, its featureless face turning toward me. The creature took a slow, deliberate step forward, and the clicking grew louder. It wasn't alone. Other figures began to emerge from the shadows, their skeletal forms shimmering in the dappled light. They surrounded me, their movements synchronized, as if controlled by a single mind. The story ends with me realizing the forest isn't just alive, it's hunting. The figures close in, there, glowing bones forming a cage of light as the world fades to black. When I moved to the small, sleepy town, I was looking for a fresh start. Life in the city had worn me down, and I was eager for quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and the comforting stillness of rural life. The house I found was perfect, an old, cozy bungalow on the edge of town, surrounded by tall oaks and thick hedges. Everything seemed idyllic at first, until the first night I noticed the figure. It was late, the streetlights casting long shadows across the empty road. As I drew the curtains to head to bed, my eyes caught something unusual. Beneath one of the streetlights, a figure stood, unnaturally still. It was tall and thin, its silhouette slightly blurred, as if the light struggled to illuminate it properly. At first I assumed it was just a trick of my tired eyes, maybe a broken lamppost creating strange shapes. I shook my head, laughed nervously, and went to bed. The next night, it was there again. This time it was closer, standing under the streetlight nearest to my house. Its posture was stiff, its head tilted slightly as though watching. Something about its stillness unsettled me, and I quickly drew the curtains, trying to ignore the growing knot of unease in my stomach. The nights passed, and the figure grew bolder. Each evening it was closer than the last, moving incrementally down the street, always stopping directly under the light. I noticed something horrifying about it, its eyes, or what passed for them. They weren't normal. They glowed faintly, too hollow. Sockets filled with a pale, spectral light. They pierced through the shadows, fixed on my house. I told myself it was a prank. Maybe one of the local teenagers trying to scare the new neighbor. Asked around town, describing what I'd seen, but the responses I received only deepened my fear. Neighbors avoided my gaze, their smiles faltering. One elderly man pulled me aside and whispered, "Don't look at it too long. It doesn't like to be noticed." I stopped asking questions after that. The figure continued its nightly ritual, its skeletal frame more pronounced under the flickering light. One night I decided to confront it. Armed with a flashlight and my phone, I stepped outside, the cool night air biting at my skin. The figure stood at the end of my driveway, its bone-like frame glinting faintly. My flashlight beam flickered as it landed on the figure, the light dimming as if absorbed by its presence. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound brave. The figure didn't move. Its glowing eyes burned brighter, and a low, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through my chest. I stumbled back, tripping over the curb, and when I looked up, the figure was gone. That night I couldn't sleep. The hum echoed in my ears, and every shadow in my house felt alive. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke, the hum was gone, but I found something new: skeletal footprints leading from my front door to my bedroom. Window. Window. I tried to leave town the next morning, packing whatever I could fit into my car. But as I drove down the empty streets, I saw it again, standing in the middle of the road, blocking my path. Its glowing eyes seemed to bore into me, daring me to move closer. I turned the car around and drove back home, my heart pounding. I knew then that leaving wasn't an option. That night, the figure stood on my porch, its bones fully visible, glowing faintly under the moonlight. It raised a hand and pointed to my window, as if inviting me to step outside. The story ends with me opening the door, compelled by a force I couldn't resist, stepping into the night as the figure's hollow eyes consumed me. The first time I heard about the curse, I was a child sitting on my grandmother's lap. She told it like a fairy tale, a bedtime story meant to entertain but also to warn. Every full moon, the cursed ones rise, she said, her voice low and trembling. They wander the town, searching for those who've forgotten the pact. The pact. I didn't understand what she meant back then. Like most children, I dismissed her words as the ramblings of an old woman with too much imagination. It wasn't until years later, when I returned to the town after her passing, that I understood. The town hadn't changed much. It was still small and quiet, the streets empty after sundown. But there was a tension in the air, a palpable fear that hung over the town like a fog. people locked there. Doors early, avoiding the streets during the nights of the full moon. I didn't question it at first, chalking it up to superstition. But that changed on the first full moon after my return. It began with a sound of faint, mournful wail that seemed to echo through the streets. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I stepped to my window, I saw them. Figures thin and skeletal. There. Translucent skin glowing faintly under the moonlight. They moved slowly, their heads swiveling as though searching for something. Their bones glinted like polished ivory, casting eerie shadows on the ground. I stayed frozen, watching as one of the figures stopped directly in front of my house. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and its head tilted upward, as if sensing my presence. My grandmother's words came, rushing back, searching for those who've forgotten the pact. The next morning, I asked a neighbor about what I'd seen. His face went pale, and he quickly ushered me inside, closing the door behind us. "You've been marked," he said. "They'll come for you. Now." He explained the town's dark history, a pact made centuries ago with an ancient force in exchange for prosperity. The pact demanded sacrifices, and the cursed ones were the collectors. If they've stopped in front of your house, they've chosen you. I didn't want to believe him, but the signs were undeniable. The next night, the figures returned, closer than before. Their skeletal frames shimmered faintly, and the wailing grew louder, more insistent. I locked every door and window, but I knew it wouldn't keep them out. Desperate for answers, I searched my grandmother's belongings, hoping to find a clue. I discovered an old diary, its pages filled with stories of the pact. One entry stood out to break the curse: "You must confront the collector. Offer it something greater than yourself." The final night of the full moon, I stood in my yard waiting. The collector appeared, a towering figure with glowing bones, its translucent skin stretched thin. It extended a skeletal hand, and I understood what it wanted. I held out the diary, offering it the truth of our family's guilt. The collector paused, its head tilting as if considering. Then, it raised its hand and pointed to the moon. I realized too late that I wasn't enough. My fate was sealed. The story ends with me standing beneath the full moon, the wailing of the cursed ones echoing as they close in, their skeletal hands reaching for me. Bye. The room was unnaturally dark, the kind of darkness that swallowed everything. No moonlight filtered through the windows, no hum of the street lamp outside. Even the faint glow of my phone was gone, as if the creature had devoured every ounce of light. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat. It was here. I couldn't see it, but I felt its presence. Heavy, suffocating, like the air had thickened. The faint click of its bones echoed in the void, growing louder with each step. My heart pounded as the sound closed in, circling me, toying with my mounting fear. Then I saw it. Its skeleton shone faintly in the dark, each bone etched with tiny symbols that seemed to shift and writhe as I stared. Its translucent skin stretched tightly over its frame, barely containing the light it had stolen. The glow pulsed rhythmically, as if mocking the beat of my panicked heart. And those eyes, two hollow voids, locked onto me, sending a chill through my body that rooted me to the spot. It didn't lunge. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The creature moved closer, its skeletal hand extending toward me. With every step it took, the remaining light in the room dimmed further, the shadows thickening like a living thing. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The room stretched endlessly, folding me into its black void. "Why me?" I whispered, my voice trembling, barely audible over the sound of its clicking bones. The creature paused. For a moment, the room was silent. Then its mouth stretched wide, splitting the thin skin over its jaw to reveal rows of glowing teeth. When it spoke, its voice wasn't a sound but a vibration, resonating deep within my chest. "Because you see." The words sent a wave of dread crashing over me. I thought of the first time I had noticed it, the faint flicker of light that disappeared when I turned my head. I thought of the darkened streetlights, the dimming lamps, the oppressive shadows that crept into my home. The creature wasn't random. It had chosen me because I had acknowledged it, invited it into my world with every fearful glance. The realization was crushing. There was no escape. It didn't need to chase me. I had already lost. The creature moved closer, the light within its bones burning brighter. I felt its presence seep into my mind, pulling at my thoughts, my memories, my very essence. My legs gave way, and I collapsed to the floor, unable to look away from the spectral glow of its frame. As it reached me, its skeletal hand brushed my face. The touch was cold, a sharp contrast to the searing heat that spread through my chest. I gasped, clawing at the air as the room dissolved around me. The light it had stolen began to pour into its body, each flicker carrying a piece of me with it. My memories flashed in vivid bursts: laughter, sorrow, every moment of my life stripped away and consumed. I felt myself fading, my vision narrowing to a single, piercing light that radiated from the creature's hollow chest. In my final moments, I understood the truth. The creature didn't just steal light, it devoured everything: your memories, your fears, your very soul, and left behind only the faint glow of your existence. When I woke, the room was empty. The light had returned, but it felt wrong, cold, artificial, like the warmth of the world had been drained. I looked down at my hands and gasped. My skin was translucent, faintly glowing from within. My reflection in the mirror was unrecognizable, a hollow face, eyes dim and lifeless, my bones faintly visible beneath my skin. I wasn't me anymore. I was part of it now. As I stumbled out into the hallway, I saw a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. Turning. Slowly, I saw the creature standing in the shadows, its glowing bones a haunting reminder of what I had lost. But it wasn't looking at me. Its hollow gaze was fixed on the street outside, where another window glowed faintly. Another light to collect. If you've ever noticed the shadows creeping in, the lights dimming when they shouldn't, think twice before you look closer. The creature thrives on your fear, your attention. The more you notice it, the stronger it becomes. If you dare, share the story. But remember, each retelling feeds the light it craves. Are you certain the glow from your lamp is steady? Or has it flickered without you noticing? Look closely: are the shadows in the corner still? Or is something moving within them?